Good evening, this is your Gentleman B970, and tonight I'm going to show you my bass rig. This is a request from people like Frank Moss. This video will be in conjunction with the bass tag with Max Proud and the funk community in America, bearing in mind that 70% of all of my traffic hits, follows, likes are from America, 10% is from Britain, United Kingdom, and 20% from Europe and the rest of the world. So you've got Max Proud, Morrissey Man 61, Tracy, Keyboard Axe Guy, people like those guys, the whole bass community, Scott's Bass Lessons that we'll feature in a video in the next video, Paul Turner, Jamiroquai, all those kind of people in that kind of aspect. You've got Milo DK, the Bass Wizard, and in that kind of aspect with the Bass Wizard, you know, you can argue that the Bass Wizard and guys like that were the guys that gave us a whole bunch of things to play, bearing in mind that a lot of the music that we play is from his nation and his kind of town. So there's a huge community in looking at bass in this kind of aspect. So we're going to look at the kind of rigging of this bass. What we do is we basically listen to the bass in this kind of fashion. And so when we think about people around the world, and we've got Max Proud and other guys, funky guys around the world, and we're looking at bass rig, what we try to explain to people in that kind of aspect is that you know, you could argue that there's this kind of brand new kind of thing that is going round, and in that kind of aspect, you know, you get a whole lot of rhythm going down. So when we're thinking in terms of the coffee depot and we're in the basement sweeping it out, making sure the coffee's dry, shoeshine jacks, and he kind of goes into that looking at the bass rig. So he kind of explains that, you know, again, and he repeats it, that there's a kind of brand new thing that's going around, and you know, there's a whole lot of rhythm going down. So what it is that when we try to do the rig in that kind of sense, it's that we want the funk, and we want to kind of forget about the punk in that kind of aspect. And obviously we've got to be careful of Sir Illuminosi, because he can get and attack everybody, including myself. So we can do bad videos, bad reviews, have bad days, you know, and everything. So we've got to try and get over the hump of Sir Illuminosi. So in that kind of aspect, looking at trying to get the rig, sometimes we're kind of tired of, you know, looking at loads of different kind of bass players, and we're kind of tired of listening to the same old funk. So what we do is we supply the funk to the bass, and it's up to the bass to respond to the power when we think in terms of Marcus Miller. So what we do is we supply the funk to the bass, and we do that by using power, and so therefore the bass has to respond to it, and when it does, we get our kind of rigging of what we need for our bass. So that's what we kind of do. We supply the kind of funk to the bass, and then the bass has to respond to that kind of playing. At this point, we can bring in someone like Billy Sheen, who's very much like myself in that sense, or I'm very much like him, I beg your pardon, where we're not very good at doing bass. You know, we're not people that sell the news. We're guys that play bass. so we're kind of heavy and kind of deep in that sense. So when you look at someone like Billy Sheehan, what they do is they supply the rock to their basses or guitars, and it's up to their basses and guitars to respond to the rock that they put into their basses. With people like Billy Sheehan, what they tend to go for is a lot of sustain, and they do that by having a really heavy headstock, sometimes a really heavy bass. So you get a lot of sustain. So when you play the bass, you can play a note and it's like lasts for hours. So with guys like Billy Sheehan, they supply the rock to the bass, and it's up to that bass to respond to it. So they apply the rock to it, and it's up to the bass to respond. But second, and this is why we're doing the video in that kind of coffee shop kind of way. So second, we look at funk. And when we look at funk, what we're trying to do is not get the sustain of Billy Sheehan in that sense. We want the bass to be slightly dank, or you could argue damp. So second, what we do is we look at how to play funk in that kind of way, where we supply the funk and power to the bass and find out how damp the strings are. So we can't really do the sort of like Billy Sheehan test, because we're not being able to work out how damp the strings are. So we're going to go through a series of stages: the first stage, the second stage, the next stage, and then the kind of final stage. And that's what we're doing here. So the idea is that when you try to find out how damp the strings are, the analogy is that you play a string and you dampen the string. So that's the first kind of stage in that kind of aspect. Second is that what you can do is play that single string and then use the other three strings to dampen the sound. So when we play the three strings, they cancel out the sound of the very first string, if you get my drift. So what it is that in this kind of sweeping up in the basement coffee depot kind of area, kind of work out, how to listen to how damp the bass is. So what I do is I go through a series of stages where we build up the sustain and resonance of the bass and then play the final note. So the notes that I actually play are kind of one by one in this kind of aspect. So the very first note that you kind of play is A. And when you play these notes, you make sure you play them almost as loud as you can to make sure that your finger goes all the way through the string. So the very first note you play is A. And one of the reasons why you kind of do that is that if you have to tune up with other musicians, then A is a very good note to tune up with. Second is D, and then E, and then G, and then finally the last note that we're going to listen to find out how damp it is E. So you go through these series of stages in the earring. So it's A, and then D, and then E, and then G, and then E. So through that kind of mode, what we're doing is each time we play the notes, the resonance is building up stage by stage until we play the final note, and it sounds like this. And now we can hear how damp the bass is. So when we do that, what we're doing is going through all of the stages, the first stage, the second stage, the next stage, and the last stage, and eventually supply the funk to the bass, and now the bass has to respond. So what does that mean? Well, what we do is we just add 2 notes to the supply, and then we've got the funk. So once we get to that kind of level, then we've got our kind of bass rig. And so when we go back to people like Scott's bass lessons that we're going to do in the next video, and we look at forget-me-nots and play the bass like this, we're not really listening to the bass at its bell level, you know, because that's what we're actually doing. We're belling the bass in that kind of sense. So when Scott's Bass Lessons plays a bass in that kind of way, we'll never truly know how damp the bass is. So therefore, if you play the bass at that kind of level, then you might end up relying on rigging to get the sounds, because what you're doing is relying on the rigging to supply the funk, where it's got to be in the sense of, you know, front of house, outboard, is that the individual supplies the funk to the bass, and then you just put the bass into an amplifier and record it. So that's the kind of thing that you get when you're looking at the rigging in someone like B970. So what it is that we want the funk, and you know, in that aspect, what we do is we supply the bass with the kind of power in order to be able to play the bass line that way, and then we've got our rigging. So thank you for watching this video, and I'll be back very shortly with looking at forget-me-nots with Scott's Bass Lessons. So thank you to you.